to get up. And on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off, all right? And we're going to stand up, and then it's going to take 2 more shots to knock us down, all right? And on the way up, we're going to take your other kneecap, and we're going to get up, and then it's going to take 3 shots to get us down.
What's up, Lions fans? We are locked and loaded and ready to roll here on our much-anticipated post-NFL draft edition of Kneecaps for Breakfast. Vince Brogar, that's me. Happy to be joined, as always, by the man across from me, Phil Byrne. And Phil, what an active week it's been for our Lions.
Yeah, about 6 weeks ago, we were just recapping the season. And we knew as soon as the draft kind of came around, there'd be 1.5 million things to go through. Vince, we've been doing this for a couple months now. This is easily the most news-packed show that we're going to have. We have so much to go through this episode, and we can't wait to break it down for you.
Yeah, we thought a couple of weeks ago, back when the NFL free agency window opened up and there was stuff happening around the NFL, we were kind of like Christmas morning almost. There's so much to talk about, and I feel like what the Lions did, both in-house and as a part of the NFL draft as a whole, like you said, Phil, out of the park as far as content goes, that we need to break down over this next, probably going to wind up being an hour plus here on this episode. Yeah. So let's kind of get things started here with our first bites here. We have a handful of players within our organization that we knew were going to be due some big time cash headed their way. And the Lions got a jump start on that process by extending the contracts of receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown and offensive tackle Penei Sewell. So those guys will not only be Lions for the next half decade or so, but they got paid. St. Brown, 4 years, $120 million, 77 guaranteed, the most amount of guaranteed money ever awarded to a receiver. And Penei Sewell, the only thing he did was wound up becoming the highest paid offensive lineman of all time at 4 years, $112 million, 85 guaranteed. So, Phil, your first thoughts here on the extensions of those two players and what that means for us moving forward.
Yeah, they're the core. They're the foundation. Came in from the same draft class. They've been here from day one of the turnaround. They've been so instrumental in terms of just changing the culture and then redefining what that culture is all about. I know these salaries are inflated, and to the working man, $100 million. They're like, oh, that person's not worth it. Vince, so many generations of people in the state have gone without seeing winning Lions football that these two guys have been able to do that in such a short amount of time. I think it is every right that they have to reset the market at their positions. These are great because you're going to get, Penei Sewell's 23. Amon-Ra St. Brown is 24. These are not guys that are 27, 28, 29, and like, hey, you're giving them a 4-year contract. They're going to play into their early 30s, and hey, we'll just hope they don't decline. You could argue they're not at their prime. They're a couple of years away from their prime even. And they've just been balling out. They are so fundamental to what has happened here that I know that's a lot of money, and I can totally understand if someone can say that no pro athlete is worth that amount of money. But man, has it been awesome to have them on our team.
Well, it's almost like, from my perspective, what's the real difference between $112 million versus like $70 million? Both are exorbitant amounts of money. We're almost splitting hairs at this point. If you're saying, well, they might be worth 85 or 90, but are they really worth it? It doesn't matter once you get past a certain threshold of amount of money. You brought up a very, very interesting point there, Phil, how when you take a look at the age of both of those players, and usually you think when an NFL player gets paid like that, that's usually their one and only opportunity to cash in. You can definitely see a pathway to not one, but both of those guys being re-signed by the Lions if they do continue to ball out and excel at the level that we've seen thus far. If both of those two players over the next 4 to 5 years continue playing at a high level, granted, they're still south of age of 30, so maybe you're not giving as many years. You're just giving them more money necessarily, or more, to bug off a hockey term here, AAV, the average annual value. You make that more favorable to the player at that point. I could definitely see a scenario where both guys are going to be Lions for many, many, many years to come, not just when this next series of contract extension runs out. Of course, you're going to move Sewell over to left tackle when the time comes, so some implications here. Taylor Decker is probably not much longer for the organization beyond probably this next season. You're going to move Sewell over to left tackle, and he'll be your left tackle of the future. St. Brown is going to be the base of your offense for the next several years moving forward. And in my mind, it couldn't happen to two better guys, two guys that love playing here, that are the heart and soul of the team. And when you ask average fans outside of our little bubble here in the Metro Detroit area, who are a couple of guys that come into your mind when you think of the Detroit Lions, I think both Sewell and St. Brown fully embody what we're trying to do here.
Without a doubt, and yeah, they're you know, this is just the first, you know, big money contract that they've got. They've got still age and so much time. I mean, you know, I don't think anyone knew at the time what St. Brown was going to develop into. You know, like they were patient and calculated with when they took a receiver. But just go back to when, you know, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell drafted Penei Sewell, that very first pick. How jacked up and excited was that war room and was Brad Holmes? And it's not just because of skill set, it's because his age. And he is so good at such a good young age that he's absolutely a core and a building block for many, many years to come.
And that's funny because that was the knock on him coming into that draft, is that he's the youngest player in the draft. And you assumed that there's going to be so much growing pains for this kid with so much youth that could be working against him, to where, as you kind of alluded to there, Phil, now we're starting to kind of see the perk of that, in that he's a whole year or two behind in age, that is, people of the same class as he is. And when guys start to break down, that extra youth is definitely going to serve him well, I believe.
Yeah, without a doubt. So obviously, these two deals get done. It does kind of, I don't know, table necessarily the Jared Goff contract extensions, but I think it just kind of gives them a little bit more time to kind of figure out how they want to structure this. I know they're going to want to get it done at some point here, as it is the quarterback position, and you know, at some point the market will reset in terms of what, you know, is going to get asked for. With St. Brown and Sewell, they were able to dictate what the market is, because, you know, they're arguably the best at their position. Whereas I think with what we're doing with Goff, I mean, he's not Mahomes. Like, that's ridiculous. You know, I mean,
it's apples and oranges.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it is going to be a lot of money, and it does have to be done in a smart way. But also, you're not going to be resetting the market at the quarterback spot.
Now, I don't like to put a whole lot of stock into what Adam Schefter of ESPN says, but his official take on it the night before the draft, when these deals got done with Sewell and St. Brown, was that the Lions camp and Goff's camp were not close. It makes you wonder, what do you think a possible holdup between Team Goff and Team Lions front office might be? Do you think it has to do with the amount of time? Do you think it has to do with that aforementioned AAV? What do you think may be a holdup as far as why this contract may not be getting done a little bit faster than we might think?
So I think Goff is going to be turning 29, I think.
Which is still not old by any means.
Yeah.
He's
especially
still
at the quarterback
south
position.
of age 30.
Kirk Cousins is going to be turning 36 before the season.
And he was just given a 4-year contract. More on that later.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, maybe signing bonus or something. Like I can't, just don't understand what the huge discrepancy would be, because I don't think it's going to be an issue with the years. I don't think they're giving him a 7-year contract. It's got to be probably 4 years.
I don't even think the money's that big of an issue, because they're only one more quarterback away from essentially trumping what they did as far as making Goff the highest paid position player, if you will. I just don't know that. Like, look at when Stafford got paid all that money all those years ago. People were saying, "Are you kidding me?" And then NFL teams went out and extended another quarterback or two, and then all of a sudden the money that Stafford got didn't seem all that extreme anymore. So I feel like you'd be looking at a same scenario with Goff, to where it's like, okay, he'll be given an exorbitant amount of money, and it'll seem like this albatross there for a few weeks until the next guy or two gets extended, and then who really cares?
I mean, could it just be a simple fact of like, I know he's getting married this summer. Um, they don't need to necessarily do it right now. Maybe they're just going to do it once the wedding is over, or like,
I
I
did
don't,
read that Goff and his
yeah,
fiance are looking for places in the Detroit area.
yeah,
So that may mean that if they're taking that extra step instead of maybe being a little bit more non-committal about their future living arrangements, maybe that means he knows something and they
yeah,
wanted to maybe go through the draft and figure out what they're going to do with that, get the other two guys figured out, and then revisit Goff once the draft was over with. I don't know, but maybe there's more to it than that.
yeah, yeah. You can go down a rabbit hole here with, you know, high value real estate in Metro Detroit, but just made me wonder. I'm just curious if Stafford ever is selling his house, because I know
I
that
was
thing
going to
was,
say, any of those
yeah,
old Pistons players from all those years ago still have a place up for sale or something. You see it all the time on the internet of
yeah.
this former
I
athlete or
know.
that former athlete trying to flip their mansion.
Yeah, I know it's not too far from where I'm currently at, but in Oakland Township, I know there's like um one little area that like Kid Rock used to own a house, and I think it was like Chauncey or Ben or someone like that was like the next door neighbor or something like that. And I honestly think no one lives there because it's just too expensive.
You're probably right about that, but like you said, Phil, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole with breaking down Oakland County real estate. That's a whole different podcast entirely. But I do want to transition into the draft a little bit. So it was a record-setting scene in downtown Detroit with the NFL draft right here in the Motor City over the course of 3 days. Over 775,000 people attended the NFL draft in some way, shape, or form. And it probably looked even more than that when you started to look at people mingling in and around the streets and around the little interactive displays that they had set up, maybe a little bit farther uptown. There was a lot of people down there, definitely more Honolulu blue than any color there by a wide margin. Phil, you had a chance to make it down there
Yeah.
for the second day, so that would have been Friday, and that would have been rounds 2 and 3 of the draft. So, what did you think for yourself being down there, being a part of such a transcendent event like the NFL draft, something where there's so many different people from so many different fandoms and avenues involved? What did you think of the experience?
Well, it felt almost to me kind of like a bizarro world, because traditionally when I'm downtown, it's within the stadium district or like Corktown. Um, for the life of me, I don't remember the last time I've made it all the way out to Jefferson and kind of like Hart Plaza and kind of like things over there, and especially not.
Probably Joe Louis Arena. I would imagine that's been gone for
Yeah.
8 years now.
So the thing that I first noticed, aside from the crowds and everything else, was how clean everything was. They did a fantastic job, making sure that trash or whatever else was spotless. Um, how developed some of the storefronts and kind of like, I don't know if it'd be like urban design would be down there. Um, Good buddy of ours who I went with after work on Friday. Um, I kept remarking that, like, I'm like, what city am I in? Am I in Toronto or Chicago, or like where am I? Because it was an area of Detroit that I just don't walk through. So like when you see all these things, and I'm like, is this a pop-up store, or is this a store that was just there traditionally? Plenty of new restaurants and everything like that. Everyone having a great time, as you did mention. Majority Lions fans. So the comparison for me was the Nashville draft, 2019, I think. And the thing that stuck out to me was it was on the main. Even though I've been to Nashville a number of times, I can't think of what the actual street is, but the main stretch of downtown Nashville, and they had that drone shot, and it seemed like that drone shot went on and on and on and on and on for like 3 miles, just showing people watching the draft. And it could have just been, because they always have the bachelorette parties and things going on in downtown Nashville, that it was only like what they were counting as like draft visitors, because it definitely seemed like there were more people in Nashville. But I will say this: driving down there, and day two of the draft starts at 7 o'clock. It was 6:15, and I thought I had plenty of time still to get down there. The area near the draft theater was closed again. They had already reached their capacity, so kind of had to play it off a little bit closer to like the arenas and things like that. Um, the draft feed was like the NFL's feed, like on a monitor, so they'd have the pick announced, but then there was no analysis, no like it was the strangest thing. So that was no good for me because I wanted to like actually get like, okay, so who did the Cardinals just pick, in the second round? So eventually went into a bar for like an hour. Lions make their pick of Ennis Rakestraw Jr. and then kind of walk down there again. And it is really a cool experience to see all the things that were on display. Not everything was open when I was down there. Um, but just getting close to like where the TV sets were and everything like that. Kind of going back to when we went in 2009, Vince, it was really quite honestly awesome. Um, for the Michigan fans out there, it was really, really funny to see the three consecutive Michigan players get drafted and literally watch Rich Eisen in real time just absolutely
Void
lose his
his bladder all over national TV.
yeah, and just see like Daniel Jeremiah and Joel Klatt and Charles Davis just laugh. And again, didn't have a monitor or anything to watch what was going live, but you could just see that they were having fun. The ESPN set, of course, had Herb Street and Nick Saban on there and things like that. So that was pretty good as well. Um, but awesome job with the planning and just the way that they had positioned the theater. It was picturesque at night. Everything kind of lit up. Really, really cool experience. Didn't cost anything to go down there. Awesome way to spend a Friday night.
What do you think that this draft experience that was put on by Detroit, do you think
Yeah.
that did anything to change the perception of the Detroit area from a national perspective? Because one thing that we do know about the NFL is that it has the ability to reach a extremely large number of people. You know that nationwide, a lot of people tuned in to ESPN or the NFL Network for this draft. And I can tell you from being at home, I had every intention of making it down to the draft at some point. Unfortunately, due to a loss in the family, we had funeral arrangements this past week, and with having to make up some work and all this other stuff, the timing just didn't work out, and I wound up having to take everything in from a television spectator standpoint. But I will say, for an event like the NFL draft that is made for TV, it looked awesome. And I got to thinking to myself, if I didn't live here, I'd think this is an awesome city and an awesome thing that the city of Detroit has going. So I want to gauge what's on your mind, Phil, about that.
So first thing, I'll just say it up front. This is a Lions podcast, and we do drink quite a bit of large amounts of blue Kool-Aid.
And it
The
tastes
way the
great.
city, the way the city was set up, the crowds that were down there. I told our buddy, I'm like, I'm ready for the Super Bowl. Like I'm ready for the Super Bowl, and I'm ready for the Super Bowl parade after we win it. It's been far too long since we've had one. The Red Wings, I think the last one, just off the top of my, yeah, the Red Wings. Kwame
15 years
Kilpatrick,
ago or
right?
16 years ago. Yep.
Yeah, and that feels like ancient history at this point. The way that everything has been redeveloped in the time since then is phenomenal. I think the other thing that you have too is not only do all the optics coming through TV look great, um, it is getting a little bit of a reputation also as like a foodie town, right? So everyone is well aware of the Conies. Everyone's really well aware now, I think, of like, the Detroit, pizza. Um, so, even if it's just people like, hey, you know what? This summer when the weather's good, um, go check out Detroit for, a weekend or something like that. I think we're going to get more people like that coming here. Long term, again, I think it's always going to be cold here. You can't fight it. I know Minneapolis has had a Super Bowl. I know Chicago probably, once they build this dome setup, will get a Super Bowl. I think Detroit gets another shot at it. I think we get an NBA All-Star game, NHL All-Star game, and yeah, I definitely felt like this kind of crowd, this kind of energy, all these people wearing Lions jerseys. I'm ready for a Super Bowl parade. That is just
Could you imagine? I mean, if there's
I,
one thing that we've
yeah,
discovered over this last year or so, it's that the people of Detroit turn out in droves when something
yeah,
positive happens.
yeah.
Could you imagine how heavily attended a Lions Super Bowl parade would be? I mean, there would be, but we thought there was traffic that was bad for the eclipse a couple weeks ago. We thought traffic was bad going down to the draft over this past weekend. You'd probably be stuck in traffic for the better part of half a day
Yeah.
for coming and going from a NFL draft parade. That would be that'd be insane.
Especially if it's like the Tuesday following the Super Bowl. Like that's not a lot of time to get time off work. There's a lot of people calling in, you know, to not come into work on that day or something. But
I think that would be have to be dubbed a statewide holiday or something like that, where everything just comes to a complete stop. Nobody goes to work. Nobody does nothing. No
yeah.
expectations of anything happening that day. It's all about the Lions. But a lot of work to be done to get to that point, unfortunately. But
Yep.
hey, a couple of guys on a podcast can dream, right? In any case, that was again a phenomenal optical situation down in Detroit from a television standpoint. I loved how the city looked. The lighting was perfect. All the necessary effects that they used were perfect. It helped that the weather held out. There wasn't a really like a driving rainstorm or anything like that during the draft that kind of made things look a little more of a dampened environment than what it was. What I couldn't fathom though was you just have so many rows and rows and rows of densely packed people. It was almost kind of like New Year's Eve in Times Square. And it got to a point where you're almost thinking, okay, what do you do once you're kind of in that sea of people? What'd you do? Just pack a pair of Depends or something like that and just hope for the best? I mean, you're down there for a long time and you ain't going to a bathroom because Lord knows if you're ever going to be able to make it back to where you just were again. And I don't think these bars are just letting random people come in and use their facilities. So
That's where if you're a Packers fan and you're wearing a cheese head, that thing's getting grabbed because someone's probably going to use it for sanitary purposes.
that's a great visual, and I'm sure that's been attempted at least once in
Yeah.
the illustrious history of Lambeau Field in Green Bay. Can't confirm or deny, but that's my suspicion. So next year, the NFL draft will take place in Green Bay. It's almost like you're on two different ends of the spectrum. You go from a big city to now the smallest market in the NFL. So it's almost like you go there for the nostalgia. But you think there's any way that Green Bay can top the experience that Detroit showed out this year?
No, but I think it will allow people that don't want to pay exorbitant ticket prices to go watch their team play the Packers. An opportunity to get to Green Bay, to kind of take that in and kind of see what that is all like. I've always wanted to take in a Lions Packers game at Lambeau. Never gotten around to it. I think I would still just hold off, until I actually, can find the ways to make that happen and go there instead of attending the draft. But hey, they love their football there, and I think the town itself, it's not going to rival anything that we saw optically this weekend. But I think there's a cool little flavor there that I think they'll be able to highlight and kind of make use of. And, after having it in like Las Vegas and, Chicago a couple years back and Philly and, Detroit and just kind of these like large urban, settings, it is kind of cool to reset it. Now, I'm not saying in 2026 they should go to, Topeka, Kansas, just in the middle of nowhere. Uh, I don't know what that would do for anyone, but I think next year.
This isn't like the MLB Field of Dreams where they play it in the smack dab in the middle of a cornfield in a town nobody's ever heard of.
Go to Rutgers, go to the birthplace of college football, East Piscataway. No, that wouldn't make any sense. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it'll still be cool, but it's at least I will say this. If it was like Cincinnati or Indy or some neighboring Midwestern city that's maybe not Chicago, that's kind of on Detroit size, um, I'd say good luck following what we just did. But Green Bay is just going to be a different experience, I think, altogether.
Yep, not bigger, not less, just different is what I think we're looking
Yeah.
at. But that's a whole nother year from now. But again, round of applause to everybody who made this past weekend possible because it looked from, again, just a fan's perspective, a local podcast host perspective. It just seemed like everything went fantastic. And of course, I'm sure the people who put the whole thing on are probably critical of their own situation and probably nitpicking things that maybe if they had to do it all over again, they probably could have done it a little bit differently. But for somebody who has zero knowledge on how things were quote unquote supposed to look, I thought everything went phenomenal. It looked like everybody had a great time. People young and old all had a great time down there. I loved seeing the little street lined larger than life NFL helmets featuring all the teams, and it looked like there was flags hanging from the lamppost featuring all the teams. It just seemed like a really inviting and welcoming environment for all, and I think they absolutely knocked it out of the park, and it definitely translated over TV.
Without a doubt, it was awesome to be down there to take it in, and yeah, TV. I still don't think did it justice because I truly was blown away when I went down there, and of course when I was in the thick of things down there, the Lions had already picked, so there was less people, which is kind of by design, thankfully, because I'd done the New Year's Eve in Times Square thing, and not being able to move in a sea of 20,000 people, that's not my thing. Like, don't care to do it again. So it was probably better this way, and I just watched the Lions pick that night, inside a bar. But
You're listening to this episode of Kneecaps for Breakfast. Vince Progar, Phil Byrne, along with you. Glad you could be with us on our post-draft episode of Kneecaps for Breakfast. So not a whole lot of surprises as far as the draft itself went. You and I last week kind of mapped out our top 10 the way that you and I both thought it would go, and you and I were both a complete lockstep of picks 1 through 4, and the way that you and I had both predicted it was the way it actually went. We won't spend too much time this episode breaking down the picks of other teams, but some statistical information. You had all 14 first round picks. So picks 1 through 14 were all offense. I think you and I gave a few defensive players in our anticipated top 10, but I think that may have been a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt type of thing. I definitely could see a scenario where they went 10 for 10 offense. I think 14 for 14 was a little bit more of a stretch than even I gave it credit for. And even more of an interesting scenario was the first defensive player to come off the board was that kid from UCLA, Latu, who you pointed out a couple episodes ago. I think my jaw about hit the floor when I thought, really, this is the kid who is going to be the first defensive player taken in this draft after being forced to medically retire, sat out for a couple years, somehow wound up back in college football. And if you would have told him that he'd be the first guy on defense to come off the board in this year's draft, I think he even himself probably would have said you were on some type of quaaludes. But in any case, the surprises started happening in the back half of the top 10 as with the 8th pick, the Atlanta Falcons, who I, again, benefit of the doubt, thought, okay, they're doing pretty good with their offensive skill players. Maybe they use this opportunity to either trade back or go defense. Well, they didn't do either one of those. They picked the number 4 quarterback off the board with Michael Penix Jr., and I feel like the ink isn't even fully dried on Kirk Cousins' contract of 4 years, 180 million they gave to him just a couple of weeks ago. And I think everybody, both down in downtown Detroit and at home watching on TV, and even Kirk Cousins and his family themselves were all floored by what transpired down there in that Falcons war room. Phil, I got to believe you felt the same way, right?
yeah, it's like the Falcons signed up for a long-term life insurance policy on Kirk Cousins, and then basically made no qualms about threatening his life as a starting quarterback in the NFL with how this went down. Penix, incredibly talented, has a history of injuries, isn't particularly young. I think he would be 26 by the time he could really get the start. You know, if you're looking at Cousins as maybe a 2-year project for what you've got there with him remaining from a contract standpoint. Didn't make a ton of sense to me, though. You know, I was thinking, oh, is this they drafted him and they're going to just basically trade him to the highest bidder? Is that what's going on? No, it wasn't that. And we don't really see that in the NFL like we would in the NBA. They picked them.
Yeah, you get
They
the rights
stuck
to
and
Michael
picked
Penix
them.
Jr.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work that way.
No. So he is their long-term quarterback. I will say this: Desmond Ritter did not get the job done, and it's very, very painfully obvious that they thought that they had no quarterbacks on the roster last year, and it completely detrimented what they wanted to do. Now they have 2 quarterbacks, but the way that they went about it, at least for next season, I don't see how this helps them. I don't see how this helps them at all. So that is a strange division, the NFC South. So congratulations, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You're probably going to the postseason once again.
My question is there something with Cousins medicals that is continuing to rub them the wrong way? And I don't know what today's recovery time is off an Achilles injury. I know that ACLs used to be you tear your ACL, you go forward to the next calendar altogether. It's an entire calendar year's recovery. Now you see guys coming back in 7-8 months off a ACL. And I got to believe that things are accelerating a little bit. When did Cousins tear that Achilles? Maybe Halloween-ish. So
Yeah,
what
it
does that
was.
do? That
Yeah.
puts him at about a 10.5 month recovery to be ready for week 1 of the regular season. Maybe they're thinking there may be a little bit more of a setback. But in that case, isn't that what you just bring in a stopgap Tyrod Taylor type of quarterback off the scrap heap to kind of move you into that transition period to when the season starts, to when Cousins is ready to come back? It just seemed bizarre that you use that kind of draft capital, the number 8 pick overall in the draft, that luckily they didn't have to go up and get, but not every team gets to pick in the top 10 very often. I just have a real hard time seeing what their rationale was as far as right now or even in the next half decade, to be fully frank with you.
So one thing that really became painfully obvious, stepping away from the Atlanta situation for just a minute, is there are basically, when you are in the top 10, there are basically 4 positions on which you want to place a premium on. It's quarterback, it's receiver, it's offensive lineman, specifically left tackle if you can get them, and defensive end. And no
Not
offense
corner,
to
looking at you, Bob Quinn.
exactly. And no offense to Dallas Turner or some of the other defensive ends there, the edge guys, the Latus. The NFL did not view them as being top 10 worthy. And that's why we saw the run on the quarterback, the receiver, and the tackle. There was no premium running back that was up there to be selected from. No, Parsons, Micah Parsons, or anything like that in this draft. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it looks like a lot of the picks that were made, the top 14, were sort of salary motivated. With they just didn't want to go down and get, Quinyon Mitchell or Dallas Turner or the this name's escaping me, but the defensive tackle from Texas,
Byron
that I
Murphy.
think went to Seattle. Yeah, Byron Murphy. So they just weren't deemed those high pick.
So you mentioned the age of Michael Penix Jr., and I saw something that said that, let's say Cousins comes back, starts the season healthy. I will give him some credit. When healthy, Cousins is a very reliable quarterback and doesn't really miss a whole lot of time when he's not fighting some type of serious injury, which hasn't happened to him very often over the course of his career. So let's say Cousins comes out, feels great, plays great, starts every game, takes every snap. I saw a bit of information that said that if Penix does not take one single snap for the Falcons this year, only two quarterbacks in NFL history would have been older than he is at the time they took their first NFL snap.
Wow.
Brandon Weeden and Chad Pennington.
Hey,
Nibble on
I
that for a minute.
I liked Chad Pennington. It wasn't great. Brandon Whedon, he was old and he just kind of sucked. I don't know what to say about him.
You're listening to this episode of Kneecaps for Breakfast. Vince Progar, that's me. Phil Byrne, that's that guy. Glad you could be with us for this post-draft edition. And it's funny because I've been hearing more than probably any other week since we started this venture, Phil, of what are you guys going to talk about on the post-draft episode? What are your guys' thoughts on the draft picks? What are you guys' thoughts on the draft? And I think we're going to be getting a lot of buzz as far as what our opinions are as far as everything that went down in Detroit this past week, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, this is, hopefully if you've been along with us for the journey to this point, hopefully we've got more than enough topics that, you're interested in hearing us ramble on about for a little bit here. And certainly the draft is no different.
And during the draft, I saw a commercial promoted by ESPN for the upcoming revealing of the 2024 NFL schedule. And I'm like, oh, that's right. That's coming up in just a few weeks. That's going to be must-see TV as well once they unveil who we're going to be playing in terms of where specifically on the calendar. We already know who we're going to be playing next year, but where on the calendar those games are going to fall and what our primetime TV situation is going to look like to kind of help us plan our fall moving forward here. That's going to be must-see TV.
Can I make a bold prediction on something? I know we got to get back into the draft picks here really quick. I think the Lions and Cowboys are going to play each other week one, and it will be in prime time.
You think that might be that first of the Monday night doubleheaders or something like that?
Yeah, because there's so much buzz surrounding that game. It was one of the highest rated games that they've had. It's the Cowboys, a brand. You've got the Lions, who are now a national team to look out for. I think that's a matchup that the NFL would want week one in prime time.
Do you think that Brad Allen and his officiating crew will be assigned to work that game?
Vince, we don't swear on this podcast. You almost got me to.
Well, luckily we don't answer to the FCC, so if something were to slip out, obviously we apologize, but we don't answer to nobody, so that's that. So let's kind of get into the draft itself. So the Lions were supposed to be picking at pick 29. And that was kind of uncharted territory for the Lions because year after year after year, because of so many years of cumulative suckitude, the Lions traditionally always seem to be picking at the top half somewhere of the draft. Now, obviously, there's outliers where maybe they go 500 or a little bit better than that, and they're picking maybe 16, 17, 18, but never in my lifetime have I personally witnessed the Lions ever make a draft pick at pick number 29 overall in the first round. So it was a hot topic of discussion. What are they going to do with that pick? Are they going to stay at 29? Are they going to trade out of that pick and go down into the second round and maybe pick up another pick or two to bolster either their war chest or use it to draft guys that are going to help them down the road? Or are they going to hone in on a guy or two that they really like and go up and get them if they're still available? And we've seen Brad Holmes trade up on a couple of occasions to go and get guys that he liked. I predicted last week that he would trade up a little higher in the first round. I think I predicted he'd trade up to 20 and go and get a guy that he likes. And that's exactly what he did. Traded up just a spot ahead of the Green Bay Packers at pick number 24 overall. Picked in many circles the best corner available in the draft and took him in Terrion Arnold out of Alabama. And that was how that went.
There's something poetic about trading ahead of the Packers to select a defensive back from Alabama. It just makes my soul feel good, Vince. I don't know. It just all seems right with the world when we can make that scenario happen.
Especially when the very next pick, the Green Bay Packers at 25 select Jordan Morgan, power forward out of the University of Michigan. Oh, wait, that's never mind. Jordan Morgan, offensive tackle out of Arizona. My mistake. It's my early era John Beeline trivia that's oozing out all of a sudden, but I digress. So, Phil, your thoughts on number one, the rationale to go up and get a guy in the first place, and then part two to that would be, what do you think of the pick of Terrion Arnold, and how do you think he helps us moving forward with the next several years?
He fits like a glove. I mean, what he does, what his strengths are, we need that outside corner. Um, and the way that the NFL is playing right now, especially with the injuries that always seem to happen at the cornerback spot, you can never have too many. He is a day one starter. There is no doubt about it. He is not he doesn't have that elite top end speed with like a 4.5 40 time, but he does everything well. He really, really does. He is sound, he is physical. He like that's all the physical the physical traits, but quite honestly, the thing that I like after we selected him, obviously he showed off a little bit of a personality. It's the fact that I think it was Nick Saban raved about his film study, about wanting to get better. And there is something to be said when the Lions have been able to draft guys that seemingly have chips on their shoulder and are willing to put in the work. See, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now that's fourth round versus first round. That the culture that is in place now, it's just like putting more gasoline on that fire. I'll tell you what, like he is coming to a place where they're going to see the highlights and he's going to hear about what happened, or I'm sure he watched the game against the San Francisco 49ers, and friggin' Brandon Ayuk, coming down with that ball. I mean, those are the things that would haunt any other team, but I always thought they would do something to be able to motivate that. And getting Terrion Arnold is the perfect mix for what they want to do from a scheme standpoint. And I think with the coverage that they need or what they're going to play, I don't think you need him to have that top end elite speed, because he shouldn't be, chasing anyone down. You look at what the Bears did, adding all the receivers under God's green earth, to the position. You need more guys in the secondary, and they were able to do it. Now, I did like Quinyon Mitchell from Toledo, like is the top guy, and he obviously was the first one, but it's a perfect scenario of, as we were talking about it, all those offensive players made this scenario happen. I really didn't think Terrion Arnold was ever in play for the Lions in this draft.
You mentioned the lack of speed, which I know a lot of people are going to be concerned by, but you got to think about, what does Aaron Glenn like to do with his corners? He's a secondary guy by trade, so this is his baby. He loves to go man. Carlton Davis, who they brought in, is more of a zone guy. So now you kind of get the best of both worlds. You got a guy who you can just put on a guy and say, don't let this guy get by you. Don't let him burn you. So I think you've got the best of both worlds. You got a guy who excels in man. You got a guy who excels in zone. The off the field stuff sounds great. It sounds like he wants to be here. It sounds like he's going to keep his nose clean. He mentioned in the post-draft interview he's going to be a great player and an even better guy off the field. And I think the last thing we need is divas or problem children here, but maybe he's kind of like that same personality or swagger as like CD Deuce was, just without the dark side. I don't think having guys that like to talk a little bit and maybe flap their jaws at the opponent a little bit is necessarily a bad thing, as long as you do your job. I think that's a great. I think it's a great addition to this team. Obviously, Brad Holmes has a thing for drafting Alabama players with what Jamison Williams and then Jameer Gibbs and then Brian Branch and now Terrion Arnold. And people talk about how it's almost like these Alabama players are built in a lab somewhere, or they're on a different planet. Just the way they've been able to win so many games and play such winning football over the years. And I think there's a lot to that. They know that they're coached a certain way. They know that their discipline is more often than not off the charts. I know we've kind of seen a dissenting argument from Jamison Williams over the last couple of years as far as, maybe keeping your nose clean and staying out of trouble. But by and large, They know what they're doing down there at Alabama. Brad Holmes obviously seems to respect that, and for the third year in a row, goes with the Roll Tide kid in the first round.
Yeah, and of course that's where Saban's bread and butter was in the defensive secondary. So not only is it are you getting that Hall of Fame coaching from Nick Saban, but it's the position or the area of the team that he specialized in, you know, prior to becoming a head coach. Like that was his where he made his money. So um yeah, really like the pick, really like the move, really like the aggressive nature of Brad Holmes to not sit and wait. I think if they would have stayed at pick 29, Darius Robinson probably would have been the guy, but he obviously didn't fall to 29. So one way or the other, I'm glad they ended up with someone that was high up on their draft board.
I love the idea of moving up if you're in a situation like this, because if you're sitting there at 29 and kind of just taking whatever's there, I think there's a lot to be said of, again, not to go the whole Rams F them picks reset, but I think that there's a happy medium to that. If there's a guy that you have a good feeling on, go up and get him. And if that means you have to sacrifice some future draft capital while you're still realistically in your window. So if they're giving up maybe a pick or two in next year's draft beyond whatever you may have given up in this year's draft, I feel like that's a little bit less important that if you are about to fall back into a rebuild or something like that. I think now's the time to be aggressive. Now's the time to go get a guy instead of being able to just kind of sit there and take whatever's there. So I applaud the aggression by Holmes in that respect. And it's almost like, okay, you're out there trying to find guys that can help you right now. And if that means you have to sacrifice a fifth round pick here, a sixth round pick there, guys who probably aren't going to make the team for you in a few months in the first place, I don't mind that mindset one bit. I'd much rather have a guy who is going to come in and make a difference for me, if not right now, than in a year or two, instead of, again, a guy who may not be here in 4 months. In any case, the Lions, with their second round pick, they had to wait a little bit longer in the second round. They picked at number 61 overall, so no real action on night number 2 of the draft, with exception of pick number 61. So the question was always, what route are they going to take? Are they going to go with an edge rusher? Are they going to go with a receiver? Are they going to go out and get some offensive line help? Those were the three positions that were in people's minds of a position that's going to be in play. And then the Lions kind of did a number over on everybody, had everybody nice and surprised. Maybe not as surprised as the whole Michael Penix fiasco from the night before, but in any case, they go for a cornerback out of Mizzou, Ennis Rakestraw Jr., who a lot of people comp to being in that first round. And it was a surprise to some, based on the number of offensive players that went off the board, that Rakestraw wasn't taken in the first round. How he fell to the second round was a question mark to a lot of people. A lot of people thought Rakestraw may go to the Lions at 29. So maybe he was a guy the Lions had a first round grade on and thought, hey, you mean to tell me that we can still get the guy we could have taken if Terrion Arnold wasn't there in the first place? But Phil, I want to know from you, what did you think of that move in two-step with what the Lions did, taking Terrion Arnold in the first round? Do you think that was excessive, taking a second quarter? Do you think it was a good pick?
So again, it's a case of, I think Brad Holmes let the board or basically the board dictate what how they were going to play this. I think the other thing to keep in mind is they have gone defensive line pretty frequently here over the last several years. Um, I'm hopeful that this is a sign that a guy like Josh Pascal, um, he should be developing into a starter. I don't think Ennis Rakestraw will be counted on as a starter. That's going to be Terrion Arnold on the other side. But he's an awesome complementary player and pick that, again, going back to what I said a couple of minutes ago with like Chicago, just loading up on three really dynamic receivers this off. Well, I guess two really dynamic receivers this offseason, um, adding to the one already in place. You're going to be in a lot of 5 defensive back sets. And the more depth that you have there that play into the system that you want, it's just the better off you're going to be. I think round 2 kind of, some of it still went the way of round 1, but then you're also seeing more, linebackers selected. You're seeing, some defensive linemen going that, you know, at some point it was just Rakestraw was just, you know, best guy available. And then, I think maybe the only other guy that I thought was in play when, the lines were on the clock would have been Cooper Beebe, the guard from Kansas State. But again, they've already addressed the offensive line, in the offseason with the starter with Zeitler. So I don't think that was necessarily pressing, but really like the pick. And he is kind of similar to Terrion Arnold in that physicality and scheme set that he brings. I think Terrion Arnold has that higher upside, but the swagger in which he plays with, I mean, we've talked about it leading up into the draft between him and Robinson. Like, that Missouri defense in the SEC was for real, and they were tenacious. And a lot of it was because of those guys, and specifically because of Rakestraw.
I think that the Lions are definitely set on corner for a while. From a down the road standpoint, Carlton Davis isn't going to be around forever. Mosley's not going to be around forever. I don't think Vildor even makes it out of camp. I think now you've got a crowded cornerback room, so I think you can let him walk and say thanks for the face mask memories and all that good stuff.
Well,
I think at this point,
Yeah.
what you can do is count on the fact that you don't need to put any money into your cornerback room for years down the line. You can start to allocate resources, whether it's making trades or giving extensions to guys or making free agency moves in other positions. You can basically look at your cornerback room and say, hey, we got 2 guys that are going to be linchpins of our organization for the next 4 to 5 years, possibly plus, depending on how they play. And they can basically take the quarterback and basically stash it away over the next several years, because if these guys pan out, can say, hey, you know what? We got that figured out. Let's move on to something else.
Yeah. I mean, I think they still have some guys that we haven't even, entirely seen, really come to the forefront in that secondary yet. But again, it's just, you're in that kind of opportunity. The first round is already passed. If you have a grade on a guy that's first round, or at least where you were originally picking at 29, and you're back in the second round, almost a full round later, and he's available, like, it's almost kind of a no-brainer with just, how awesome that really, played out. And credit again Brad Holmes, for just really, doing what needed to be done, get that through there. But yeah, again, we still have Amik Robertson, who was also brought in. I don't think you want him on the outside.
He'll be your slot corner.
I was trying to think of who it was that I was thinking of. Stephen Gilmore. We haven't even seen him play yet. So I think you are right. Vildor probably, if I was to set how this roster is going to play out and how the depth is going to play out, he probably is the odd man out at this point. So quite interesting how that all kind of played out in the first and second round. But hey, we went from arguably the least or the position with the least depth, prior to the draft to now one that I think most folks feel pretty comfortable. I mean, is it awesome? Is it great? No, probably not yet, but we at least have the potential to be promising, I think.
So no picks in the third round for the Lions. So that would be all that they would do on night number 2, which was Friday, because of the trade up to move higher into the first round. The Lions lost their third round pick, and they did not have any fourth round picks, so they were not going to pick again until the 5th round. So you're probably talking a good 80 or so draft picks are going to go by without the Lions making so much as a single selection. So what does Brad Holmes do? He makes not 1, but 2 trades up in the 4th round to kind of get things rolling on day 3 of the draft with pick number 126 overall, the Lions' 3rd pick of this year's draft. They go up and get offensive tackle Giovanni Manu. And when I mean go up to get him, I mean that literally in a few different ways, meaning they went up to get him from British Columbia, as in Canada, not from the United States, from Canada. And they went up to get him because he is a big boy at 6'8", 3.5. And Phil, I think there's a couple of different ways you can go with this guy. I think maybe when Sewell makes the jump over to left tackle, when that time comes, maybe you put him over at right, maybe even let him get his feet wet at guard a little bit for some guard depth. I think there's a few different ways you could go with Mr. Manu once he kind of gets acclimated here in Allen Park.
The only other guy that I've ever seen be this big on the Lions is Dan Skipper. So, you could almost kind of look at him as like a Skipper replacement. When we go in those really, really heavy sets, we're probably going to figure a way to get him on the field.
Just as long as we don't ask him to report as eligible, I think we're okay.
Hey, maybe. Yeah. But again, we mentioned on the top of the show with Sewell getting that extension. I think the long-term play is moving him over to the left. You at least have this year and probably next year. Whether they bring back Decker on like a, extended or a 1-year deal or something like that. To kind of figure out, would this guy be able to transition over to the right side if you got Sewell over there? They like his potential, very, very raw, obviously, with coming in. Be honest, I've never heard of the guy, never saw him play. So completely shocking when the pick happened. But this is one of those, if this was Bob Quinn, I would be legitimately concerned, right? There is enough goodwill with how Brad Holmes has been able to negotiate and analyze a draft board and get the guys that have developed into something that I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt of this one. I can see where you don't get guys this size every single day. And if you can get him in with Hank Fraley, one of the most respected offensive line coaches in the NFL, to develop into something, hey, this is going to be an awesome pick. Because again, premium positions, left tackle, offensive line, both tackles. If you got one in the 4th round that you can develop into something, this would be awesome.
It's no secret that Brad Holmes' background is in scouting. Could you imagine if this kid from the middle of nowhere, British Columbia, turns out to be a stud offensive lineman someday? That's a masterclass in scouting, going to somewhere in a different country to go and find a guy who you got to lead on at, again, 6'8", 350, and people who have spent a lot of time in the University of British Columbia circles say that this kid has the potential to be generational. That's a masterclass in scouting if this kid turns out to be anything.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'd never seen his footage before, never saw him play, but after they drafted him, I mean, man, did he stick out in that footage. I mean, he's just so much bigger than everyone else.
So the Lions then, just a couple of picks later, 6 to be exact, moved up again into the 4th round because, again, they weren't going to be picking until a little bit later in the draft. They found a guy who I had seen mocked to them on a couple of different occasions. They went up and got safety out of Iowa, Sion Vaki. I actually saw him, I think, going to them maybe in the 3rd round in a couple of mocks that I had seen. They wind up getting him in the 4th round at pick 132. Interesting note about Vaki there. He primarily plays safety, but he was asked to pinch hit at running back on a couple of different occasions for Utah. He actually ran for like 163 yards over the course of a single game last year. So there is a little bit of versatility there. I'm a little bit curious why they went up to get him of all people, because you've already got Brian Branch as a safety. You've got Kirby Joseph as a safety. You got Melifonwu, who's really starting to come into his own. Maybe you're almost at a point where you're looking at what you have and you're looking at the fact that, hey, we've got to start putting money into keeping guys around. We're not going to be able to keep everybody around. Maybe if Melifonwu continues to grow and develop into a legitimate safety, maybe almost kind of use him as trade collateral moving forward. Maybe start to acquire some draft picks to again, build up your war chest or use to go out and get guys, and then you have his would-be replacement already in house. I'm not exactly sure if it was something like that, maybe just some forward thinking of forward thinking, but I thought, again, still, you've got a receiver you need to go out and take a look at. You've got an edge that you need to go out and take a look at. I thought it was kind of interesting that you go up once again to take a safety at that particular spot.
So, a couple things. He played both ways at Utah, and I think one thing that is really interesting is that I think this was on the NFL Network feed. They identified him as a running back, so that kind of leans into like how the Lions would assess him. I think he's going to be a running back for this team. I think he's going to be their kick returner. Um, I think he's going to be one of these special teams ace. Jalen Reeves-Maybin is getting up there in age. I think he's going to be this like jack of all trades, special teams kind of guy. That like if you really needed him to go play safety, he could. But I I love Craig Reynolds. I think he's kind of Craig Reynolds' replacement. And I think that's how they view him, just that punishing. He's only going to get 3 rushes in a game, but when he does, he's going to give them all hell because they're not going to be able to bring him down. And that kind of goes back into like Dan Campbell, when he came in originally, like that's kind of that power running game that you thought that they would have. But by all intents and purposes, from what I've heard on this, because I was a little puzzled by this as well, other than just knowing that there was a lot of interest from the Lions side. Um, but the Lions and the 49ers, who were also very interested in him, viewed him actually more as a running back.
During the pre-draft process, when I was looking up a lot of these guys, I kept on seeing his stats and whatnot as far as a safety. He's going into the draft as a safety, and he kind of filled in at running back when needed, but he's more or less going to be a safety. That's good intel, Phil, if what you're saying is true about how they may kind of use him as a jack of all trades type of thing. And I really wish that you would have warned me ahead of time, Phil, before you started on that Craig Reynolds bit, because I could have at least told my wife to hit the mute button before you went into that, because she's the biggest Craig Reynolds fan on the face of the earth. But in any case, that's a situation where, again, you've got Montgomery, you've got Gibbs. If something happens, it's not like a repeat of that Buccaneers game where Craig Reynolds is the judge, jury, and executioner at running backs. Now you've got some type of depth, but you've also got him as a special value piece in that you can keep him on your 53-man roster without having to keep 3 or 4 strict running backs. You can use him in other areas, and then if need be, he can step in at running back if the need calls for it.
So with him, a little bit more into his scouting from what I've heard is that small sample size at running back was enough to draw the interest from what the Lions wanted and what from the 49ers were evidently interested in. I think the Patriots might have been another team that when they were going about this, they do the, top 30 visits, they meet with them at the combine, they do all this sort of intense scouting. So when the draft comes around, there's about 5 guys that you can really tell who teams are interested in and if they have met with them at each way, like level of the way. But it's that small sample size. And then for him, one of his flaws was incredibly tough hitter. And you can see it in the way he runs in some of his running back highlights. But he just is not like, he doesn't have, I guess, I think it was, they said he didn't have like the knees, or like the flexibility in bending his knees, that would be required to really play great coverage at the safety position. It was like he was on train tracks. Like he's a straight line. Like, so like if he's coming down to the box, it's almost like an additional linebacker. He's going to like knock the lights out of someone. But if he, had to go cover a tight end, going upfield 20 yards, he probably would have been burned each time. Interesting player though, and I truly think he's gonna make his bread and butter on special teams. But I wouldn't be shocked if we see him carrying the ball a couple times a game.
So no action in the 5th round for the Lions. The Lions move up again, noticing a pattern here. In the 6th round, they move up 16 spots from where they were originally supposed to make their next pick. They draft defensive tackle out of LSU, Mekhi Wingo, who some people are saying that may be one of the biggest day 3 steals out of anybody. A little bit undersized for a D tackle, but We kind of talked about it a little bit earlier with some of their other selections. It's a lot of off the field stuff that I think really maybe wowed some of the Lions front office guys. His work and practice ethic earned him 2022 Iron Tiger Award. Instead of packing it in after an injury, he preparing for the NFL draft like a lot of guys were. He continued to rehab to return to play in the bowl game as opposed to, just blowing that off altogether. 6 foot, only 284 pounds. Again, a little bit undersized for a D tackle, but they've got guys already in place with DJ Reader and Aleem McNeil. But who knows what's going to happen as far as the future goes. Never hurts to have a little bit of depth on the interior of your defensive line.
Yeah, I think he's going to be able to spell Aleem McNeil. He's a little bit more of McNeil's body type. You drafted Broderick Martin last year. He's kind of that bigger body, more of the DJ Reader type as a backup. So good depth piece. It looks like he's one of the better pass rushing defensive tackles that was in the draft. Sounds like he works hard. When you're looking at day 3 picks, this is what you want to. This is what you want to get. And I think the other two that were on day 3, I think there's some question marks whether it's how they're going to transition to what they're playing, or just was it a little bit of a reach, but this is kind of like slot meets production, and I think he'll be a good depth piece for the Lions.
And then last but not least, pick number 210 overall in the 6th round of the Lions draft, guard Christian Mahogany out of Boston College. Any thoughts on him as far as how he fits into this offensive line? Do you think he's a guy who even makes the team? How you feeling about this?
He's got a great name. I mean, Christian Mahogany from Boston College. I don't know. I've never seen him play. I think just finding a guard, was kind of a nice little cherry on top. Just because
Zeitler's not going to be around forever. Graham Glasgow's not going to be around forever. Eventually, they are going to have to find their guard of the future, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. So I don't know much at this point in the draft. You're kind of just hoping something can stick around for a couple of years, playing in the preseason a little bit, and just develop. Hope to God we don't have to start this guy at any point in the season.
So that's the Lions draft of the year 2024, with 0 true edge players taken off the board, no receivers or offensive skill players for that matter in their truest sense taken in this year's draft. So that kind of means, to me at least, that you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier on in the pod, how the Lions must be content with what they have on their defense, whether it's a platoon of Pascal finally coming into his own, or James Houston being the guy that he was over that 6 or 7 game sample size where he looked the part, or John Kaminsky coming in and mop up duty or to fill in on injury. They must think that among that group of guys, they have enough of a impact to where they can line up across Aiden and really generate enough respect to maybe let Aiden cook a little bit, and having to respect the other side of that defensive line. It just would have been nice, in my mind, if they would have gone out at some point, because they proved they were aggressive all draft long, moving up to go get guys. Go up and get a guy that can line up across Aiden and can really turn a weakness into a strength, because even though I liked their approach to building up that secondary, I've always believed that if you can generate a good, solid, respectable pass rush and get to that quarterback quicker, you're asking less out of your secondary. So it doesn't really necessarily matter who you have back there in your corner stable or amongst your safeties. As long as you are generating a good pass rush, you're asking less out of your secondary.
I raised this, though, Vince. Do you believe the Lions, at this point in time, we made the NFC Championship game, are one of the top 5 teams and franchises in the NFL?
Part of me is a little bit concerned with what I'm seeing in our own division. I would say on paper, yes, but I don't even know if that necessarily translates to us even necessarily winning our own division.
That's a valid point. I think generally entering the season, everyone's healthy, rosters being what they are. I think most would consider the Lions heading into the season an elite team, one of the at least top 5 or 6 teams. You look at the atmosphere that was on display in Detroit, the fan base, the passion for winning, the culture that's in place. I'm fully convinced that we are still going to get some vets at wide receiver and at edge prior to training camp. Some guys are going to want to play
Particularly a
here,
big body
and some
target
guys
wide receiver.
are exactly because I love that we're seemingly giving a lot more faith to Jamison Williams to really kind of develop into more than just a couple of gadget plays a game, and actually get into the bulk of plays out there. But I don't think he's quite there yet to be counted on, every single series. So you're going to have to do something. And it wasn't addressed. I don't think we're going to be in the market for T. Higgins. I just don't think that's reasonable.
I just think the asking price is going to be too steep more than anything else.
Yeah. But I think it's another topic for another show. With how aggressive he was in the draft, I would not be so shocked to see Brad Holmes trade away that first if he knows he can get difference makers at those 2 spots.
Hold that thought, Phil, because that's a really great point. And I say we lead off our next pod with that question right then and there, because that's a brain teaser right there. And I say you and I both take the week to figure out what camp we're in on that and roll with it to kick off our next episode of Kneecaps for Breakfast. We are all out of time on our post-draft episode, but we had a great episode. Phil, great job to you as always. We'll be right back here at it next week with more great Kneecaps for Breakfast. For my buddy across the way, Phil Byrne, Vince Brogar saying good morning. Go Lions, forward down the field, over and out.